Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Daniel Crosby, a psychologist, a behavioral finance expert, and a New York Times best-selling author. Dr. Crosby is best known for his groundbreaking work in helping investors understand the psychological factors that influence financial decisions, a topic that I'm passionate about. He joined me to share how his latest book, The Soul of Wealth, can help us find the right balance between monetary wealth and true soulful wealth in retirement. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Daniel Crosby. Welcome to the Retirement Cafe podcast, Dr. Daniel Crosby. How are you?
Justin, good to be with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I've been an admirer of your work for a long time and read many of your books. And I've got your latest one in front of me, which I'm very much enjoying. I've got the hardback and I'm also listening it to on Audible. So you've got two sales there. But before we dive into your latest book, can you share a bit about your background? And I'm always really intrigued. How did you end up doing what you're doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's good to be here. I am a psychologist by education. So I actually went to school and I have a PhD in clinical psychology. So about 3/4 of the way through my doctoral program, I was working with clients. I was, in session with clients 40 hours a week, and I was absolutely burning out. I mean, I began giving giving psychotherapeutic services when I was 23 years old, which I think we can both agree is a great time to dispense life wisdom to people at 23 years of age. And so, by the time I was 27, I mean, I was just burnt out, and I frankly just had bad boundaries. I was taking my work home with me. My clients, many of them were having severe trauma and severe distress and going through some of the worst things that life can throw at us. And I just didn't have the ego strength or the boundaries to leave that at work. And so I came to my dad, who is, my dad and a great friend and a financial advisor. And I said to him, hey, I love human behavior, studying human behavior and why people do the things that they do is a joy in my life. But I don't think I want to do it in a medical setting. And I'm sort of out of ideas. What do you think I should do? And my dad, who, I mean, this is 15, 20 years ago, my dad, who had never heard of behavioral finance, said, well, hey, there's a lot of psychology in my work. And, a lot of what I do for clients is manage their emotions and their fears and their greed. And maybe you could look into something there. And so that comment from my dad, he sent me to the local bookstore and said, hey, go get some books on investing. And that comment from my dad is, long story short, what put me on the path to where I am today, which is, a career that's been wholly devoted to studying the psychology of money and why people do the things that they do with their money.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, I do find it an absolute fascinating subject myself. Always trying to consider why my clients are making decisions that they're making, and also realizing that I'm not beyond these. I'm not beyond these behavioral biases as well. And I, again, through my career, I'm significantly older than you, but I've been doing this for 30 odd years now, which I find quite extraordinary. How did that happen? But if I look back at those decisions that I was making in my 20s, they were like, I went through my first crash was in 1987 at the age of 17. And like, oh my gosh, look what's going on in the world. And then I thought I was all, God's gift to investing in the dot-com boom. And then realized that actually, just because a business was a good idea didn't mean that the price I was paying for it was a good price. And lost not a significant amount of wealth, because in my early 20s, I didn't have a significant amount of wealth, thank God. But, just made some daft decisions. And yes, 30 odd years later, many of your books and an insight into way we make decisions over that period of time has probably helped me give a little bit more sage advice. But coming back to your books, the Behavioral Investor and Laws of Wealth, what was your really your intention behind your books?
So, my first two books, the Laws of Wealth was sort of written to speak to the planning side of the psychology of wealth, right? So, sort of how can you stay out of your own way? What are the most common behavioral biases and behavioral traps that we fall into? How can you avoid them? Right? That was kind of that book is was a primer on behavioral finance from sort of a planning perspective. The behavioral investor has a great deal more about like how can we the meat and potatoes of allocating assets and picking stocks, and what does psychology tell us about that. And then this new book sort of assumes that those foundational things are in place, and it assumes you're making good decisions, and when you do make good decisions over time, you end up with a little money. And now it says, okay, so what do you do with this, and how do you make life good, and how do you make life meaningful and purposeful and vibrant? Because this is a bit of a soapbox of mine, but we could get very down the weeds with this, but this is the wealthiest the world has ever been. I mean, we have more abundance and safety and wealth and riches than the world has ever had. And yet, the world, at least the Western world, is profoundly sad and has sort of an impoverished spirit, if you will. And so, there's a disconnect between the financial wealth that the developed world is enjoying so richly and sort of how we're all doing.
Yeah, yeah. And for the listeners of this podcast thinking about retirement, and obviously we kind of need to get people to think about retirement way, way, way before they even get close to it, because actually there's what's where they can have significant impact, on their 30-year future self. But what are the real dilemmas I see people facing is this, at 55, 60, 65, they've spent 30 years accumulating, and they've been very focused on diligently saving in their workplace retirement schemes, or their private schemes, and maybe additional savings, and thinking about, for your audience, the US college, for your college education, for our university education, they're thinking about their children, they're thinking about all those things. But all of a sudden, they reach this point where they stop saving and they start spending, and I see, it's a massive amount of stress, because all of a sudden, I mean, some people in the UK have kind of guaranteed state pension benefits, which I know you have, social security benefits, but then they have these defined benefit pensions. They're much less and less available now. So then people have got and amassed whatever their savings are in investment funds, but they've got to start drawing down on it, and they're no longer contributing. So often they can see that continue to fall, or to draw more capital out than it accrued in a year is a significant shift, and it becomes a bit terrifying for people. How do you think people can address that?
So this is one of the thorniest behavioral problems we see. I did research on couples. I interviewed 425 couples here, well, in the U.S. and Canada, and I basically asked them, "What do you fight about when you fight about money?" And it was some of the coolest research I've done. The number one thing that we found was people in partnerships tend to disagree about the best use of money is the best use of money to enjoy today or to secure against an uncertain tomorrow. And it was nearly 50-50. So you've got half of the people in the world are just sort of natural savers. And they have a hard time flipping that switch because that's definitely the way that they're wired. And so I think we have to approach this from a few levels. One of the chapters in The Soul of Wealth is called Take the Worst Case Off the Table. And I give the example in the book of Hyundai, the auto manufacturer, who in the great financial crisis, they took the worst case off the table by their what they called their Hyundai Assurance Program, which was if you lose your job, if you buy a new car from us and you lose your job, we will take it back, no questions asked, and give you your money back, right? And that was at a time when people were frozen in fear, a way that they got them to sort of take the worst case off the table. So I think there's a piece of that that can unfreeze people who are entering sort of the decumulation phase of retirement too. Like, okay, what's the bare minimum that we need to reach, right? Is it a paid off house, a paid off car, and X amount of dollars in the bank? Okay, that's fine. We can keep it at that level. We won't go below that level, but that'll buy us some safety. I think another thing that we have is that people become their personalities become too wrapped up in the dollar that they see on the screen. Um, their self worth and their net worth have been too tightly conflated, and so when they see the net worth start to go down, their sense of self starts to go down too. So I think that in some cases
Mm.
it's a matter of people too tightly having wrapped their ego and their personality and their worth with their financial success. And so I think in some cases that's the disentangling that needs to happen. And in some cases, I think it's sort of a lack of vision. In the book I talk, there's a couple of chapters in the book about the power of purpose and the power of meaning. And Stephen Covey, in his seminal book, right, he talks about, I'm going to misquote him here, but this is directionally right. Like, basically the only way you can get past the no of fear is to have a bigger yes burning inside of you. So, we have this no of this pushback against wanting to spin down that money. And sometimes the only way that we can do that is to find something that is more exciting than that is scary. And maybe that's leaving a charitable or a philanthropic legacy. Maybe that's trips with the grandkids. It could be 100 things. But I think sometimes people haven't found the way to spend money that is as exciting as saving money feels good, if that makes sense. So I think there's
Yeah,
many angles you can take this from.
yeah. And the other huge quandary I see when I'm talking to clients, and this a lot of this comes from our regulator, um, about assessing someone's attitude to risk. Now, obviously, this is a psychological kind of behavior, but you know, in my perspective, if I ask someone their attitude to risk around money, they're going, "I don't want any risk around my money." It's a nuts question. It's like, why would I? Especially, I've just reached retirement. I don't want to take any risk. And then, of course, you can unpack the risk of inflation and a fixed income. A fixed income and continual inflation. A 30-year retirement for a couple. That's a huge downward slope. So we need possibly to take some risk just to kind of match our cash values on an ongoing basis. So what we take to the supermarket each week can be maintained in its buying power. But really, if again, coming back to that question, what's your attitude to risk? Most people, there isn't one. How would you, I mean, I think there's an element from our regulator that is not, they're not really telling the truth. There's risk in cash as bonds as well as equities. But how would you, you know, for those who are listening, how would you kind of unpack that risk conversation?
Yeah, so I think you started to address it with some of your comments around purchasing power and inflation. I think first we have to educate that oftentimes the greatest risk of all is taking no risk. And so for people who sit in cash, and again, there's a chapter on this in the book, right? Um, For people who want to sit in cash, at least in the US, I don't know what I assume the British stats look similar. You
Yeah.
lose about 3% a year in purchasing power, guaranteed. And I mean, sometimes it's much more. Here, it's been much more recently. And so there's a risk in that, right? I mean, there's like almost a certain risk in, taking no action is going to result in a guaranteed loss of wealth, a guaranteed loss of purchasing power. So first, like, let's get our minds around that risk and call that what it is. Okay. So once we've sort of accepted that the greatest risk is taking no risk at all, now I think we move on. And what I found is that people broadly fall into two camps with the next thing that I'll talk about. There's the risk of, the sort of the fear of missing out, which is a form of psychological risk, like the risk of underperformance. And then there's the risk of regret, the regret of loss or that sort of thing. And most people are more tightly attuned to one than the other. For me, I'll underperform all day long, but losing money is hard for me. And, my wife is the same way. For other people, they're more wired for upside. And the greatest risk for them is, the risk of sort of a dull year or lame returns or muted returns. And so I think, first step is understand that the greatest risk is no risk of all. Second is sort of personalizing a bit by saying, look, is this person more in the fear of missing out camp or the fear of regret camp? And then when we move past that, you can talk about the three dimensions of risk. And psychology actually introduces a third dimension of risk. So at the risk, haha, of getting a little a little wonky here. There's sort of three pillars of risk. One is your risk tolerance. This is your long-term willingness to make, risk and reward trade-offs. Most people have a relatively stable, desire to take more or less risk in terms of a risk reward trade-off. Next, we have your risk capacity, which is how much risk can you afford to take given how much money you've saved, how big your goals are, your age, your time to retirement. So, all else equal, being richer, being younger, and wanting less gives you, more risk capacity. But then the final piece is that risk composure. This is the psychological or the behavioral piece, which is how emotional are you? And what is the likelihood that a short term emotional blip in the markets is going to throw you for a loop? And so people need to understand all three facets of that, right? Like, and
Yeah.
and and how can you move the needle on those three to make sure your risks are aligned? So it's a multi-phasic, multifaceted thing, but it begins with education, and I think it ends with education.
Yeah. Yeah. And yet again, it's just hugely complex, which you've just, for the average person in the street who's just looking at their pension portfolio and they're going, they're looking at whatever return they've received in the last 12 months. Most people don't even have a clue where that's actually invested and the risks that the manager is actually taking with their
Yeah,
money.
it's true.
Um, So an appraisal of that, first of all, is is obviously important.
Mhm.
Now, turning to your book, there's a chapter, and I love the book because this is in essence there's 50 stories, so you can dip into it. You don't have to read it cover to cover. You can literally go through the titles and go right. Oh, that looks really interesting. And coming back to I've got two stories I want to two of the 50 I really want to chat to you about, and one being I think very relevant to what we've just been talking about is the chapter listen to women and how brilliant women are at investing.
Yeah, I'm glad you no one chooses that one. That's a good one. That's a good one to talk about. I'm glad you chose that one. It's toward the end of the book.
Yeah.
So the listen to women chapter I really wanted to have in there because women are the ultimate investors. And women outperform men in every context. Women like professional fund managers, hedge fund managers, mutual fund managers, uh, like little mom and pop investment groups, retail accounts, everywhere. Women outperform men, and they do so handily. And we could talk about the reasons why in just a second. But what's fascinating is when you ask groups of people that include 50% women, like if you ask a group of, 50% men, 50% women, um, who's who's a better investor, men or women? 91% of people, half of whom are women, will say men are better invested and better investors, even though the research is unequivocal that that's not true. And so we have this weird situation where women are kind of the ultimate investors and no one believes it, not even them. And so I'm trying to get the word out, Justin. I'm trying to get the word out that, women need, women tend to, at least, again, at least in the US, I assume it holds true for your part of the world, tend to be more involved with the day to day sort of household finances, but less involved with the big picture, like investment decision making, which is arguably the more, they're both important, but arguably, the more important and more consequential part of it is like, what are we doing with our big money?
Yeah.
So women need a seat at the kitchen table and at the boardroom table when it comes to making financial decisions. And when it comes to why, part of it is nature and part of it is nurture. There's a great book called The Hour Between Dog and Wolf that talks about just sort of the physical, things like testosterone and the ways that things like testosterone are implicated in investment decision making. Women have 10 times less testosterone than men, and it turns out it's not great for making level-headed decisions. So
Right.
I think
Yeah.
women have a biological advantage. And then you think from a nurture perspective, think what men are rewarded for versus what women are rewarded for. Men are rewarded for arrogance, surety, bravado, being loud, pounding the table. Women are socialized to be more thoughtful, more demure, more quiet, more contemplative, and that list of that list of adjectives is a good a list of adjectives for a good money manager. Someone who
Yeah.
is deliberative and thoughtful and slower and more humble. So at both the biological and the level of socialization, women are really set up to be better investors, and sure enough, they are.
Yeah. Yeah. I found it absolutely fascinating. And then just thinking, okay, so how do you how do you bring that to play? And I was thinking about, I wonder how many, I don't know whether it's obviously it's probably not possible to do, but thinking about Bitcoin and wondering how many men are investing comparable to how many women are investing. And I just have this gut feeling. I've got nothing more to it than that. This gut feeling. There's more men in the Bitcoin race than there is women. I don't know whether I'm right on that, but I
I
just feel. I mean,
I'd wager a lot of Bitcoin that is the truth. I mean, that is
yeah,
definitely the case that I've seen.
yeah, yeah. So again, the thoughtful kind of, you know, I run my as a very global passive all equity, low turnover portfolios that I run for my clients. And, the intention is to be boring. There's nothing more to it than that. And I think any women who I do engage with on that front are kind of going, yeah, that seems to be fine with me. But yeah, it'd just be. I thought it was an absolutely fascinating chapter, and more people should listen to the women in their life when they're talking about their money.
Yeah, sure.
Um, so, uh, though I do also find that in a lot of couples, and maybe it's the age groups that I'm working with, um, a lot are quite disinterested, and kind of go, my husband sorts that out type of thing. And, I'm really, I'm quite enjoying the coffee and a chat, Justin, but really, as long as you can tell me that I'm okay, then that's all I really want to know.
Yeah, it's interesting. You see what we see is there's a confidence gap among older women that narrows almost to the point of being non-existent in younger women, and there's sort of an interest gap and a confidence gap. And I
Right.
think that a lot of women have been socialized to be disinterested, or they've been socialized to say you're not
Ah,
good at this.
interesting.
And if even if you look at little girls and little boys' math scores, they start to diverge around, here I know our grades are going to be different, but around the age of 10 or 11. And what you see is that girls start to be socialized. Their math scores are neck and neck with boys, all through elementary school. And when they
Mm,
start getting into middle and high school, girls and young women start to be socialized away from STEM careers, math and science careers, and they start to be socialized towards these pink collar professions that are maybe a little more in sort of the human resources, human behavior type part of things. So I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that sort of in nature, right? In nature, women and girls are just as interested in all of this as men and boys, but society has sort of pointed them in ways big and small to other places. And I think if we can, part of it is we have to have eyes to see that, so we stop doing it and give the next little girl Einstein the chance to the chance to discover her career.
yeah. Yeah. Fascinating. Um, Yeah, really interesting. Really interesting. I'd like to unpack that more if we had the time. Let me turn to the other chapter that I'm going to slaughter in my pronunciation. I'm sure this is a chapter called "You Are," or essay in essence. I think we could call these "You Are Not Your Things." This is about Denis Diderot, a famous 18. I was unaware of Denis Diderot, and I hopefully I've got the pronunciation correct. Was a famous 18th century French philosopher and co-founder and writer of the Encyclopédie. And this is a fascinating story. Tell me a little bit about this. And how did you discover this?
I collect weird stories like it's my job. I mean, I guess it is kind of my job, but yeah, the Diderot effect is this philosopher, right? He didn't have a whole lot of money. And the Queen was a fan of his work, and I believe it was he had a child who was getting married, and he needed some cash, and this Queen says, "Look, I'll buy your library, like effectively, like I'll buy your journals and your books." And
In essence, he's selling his royalties, isn't he? His lifetime work. He's selling them for a cash sum up front.
correct. Yeah, he's getting an advance against sales on his book to the Queen. And so he gets, I believe it was about $60,000 US in today's dollars. And so he helps to pay for this wedding, but he buys himself a beautiful robe, right? He buys himself a beautiful robe. But once you're laying around the house in your gorgeous silk robe, the couch that you're laying on starts to seem a little shabby. So then you've got to replace the couch. And when you replace the couch, now the lamp looks outdated, and now you replace the lamp, and now you need new shutters on the windows, and on and on. And so the Diderot effect is this idea that sort of consumption begets consumption, and that oftentimes buying one expensive bauble will lead to an avalanche of likewise expensive baubles. As I sit here and look at my guitars and my amps and my chords and my pedals, I can attest that this is true.
It's brilliant. I mean, yeah, I think we can all listen to this and go, yeah, we've all been slightly guilty of, well, majorly guilty maybe of. It seems like it's no good having a smart suit if you've got really scruffy shoes.
That's right.
Well, why? Well, because you look silly, or we feel that we look silly, and that's it. Yeah. So there's a lot of, you know. Um, it's a fascinating book. As I always found all your work fascinating. I only wish I had the time to study it even more. But I think I really can recommend it to our listeners, and in fact, all of your work. And you know, so much of financial success, the real theme running through all your work is that financial success is not so much about you picking the right stock, finding the next Amazon, finding the next, .com in essence, which is going to shoot, or buying Bitcoin, 15 years ago or whenever you possibly could. It's just about understanding how you behave around money and then making some sensible decisions. Maybe you just ask your mum. Um, would be a first place to start, because she seems to be the smartest person in your in the natural in the natural world around you, from what I can read.
Yeah.
But actually, these just thoughtful decisions and understanding your biases can really significantly enhance your long-term wealth. But not just long-term wealth. Then with the wealth, how do you then continue to have happiness around money? Because there's no point, as you continually address in the book, there's no point having lots of wealth if you're, as the saying I'm sure you have in the in the US and in the UK, we just say, the unhappiest person in the graveyard.
Right.
You know, that's just nuts as well. So, I can highly recommend it. I really enjoyed it. As I say, I'm listening to it on Audible at the same time, on my dog walk in the morning, and getting a lot of wisdom. So, thank you so much for writing it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to write it, and thank you for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. So, well, once again, thank you so much for your time, Daniel. Where can people find more about your work and make contact and maybe follow you?
Sure. The name of the book again is The Soul of Wealth. Probably Amazon's probably the easiest place to get that. Hope everyone will go check it out. I have a podcast called Standard Deviations. I'm on Twitter at Daniel Crosby and on LinkedIn, Daniel Crosby, PhD.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, we'll put all those in the show notes. I highly recommend reading some of Daniel's work. And again, once again, thanks for taking the time to chat to us.
Thank you, Justin.
A massive thank you to Dr. Daniel Crosby for taking the time to join me today. You can find links to Daniel's books and how to connect with him in the show notes wherever you've listened to this episode. I hope you found our conversation helpful. If you have, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It really does help more people like you find us. And for more interviews and retirement planning videos, you might want to check out my YouTube channel. Just search for The Retirement Cafe with Justin King, or click the link in the show notes. You can also get in touch with feedback or guest ideas. You can reach me on hello@theretirementcafe.co.uk. So until next time, I'm Justin King, helping you feel more informed in your retirement.